Looking back now, I should have seen it coming. But I didn't. I was too caught up in trying to make things work, trying to hold on to what I thought was still a solid relationship. It didn't help that Sarah was always so good at covering her tracks. She had this way of acting like everything was normal when deep down, I knew it wasn't. It started small. Little things at first. She'd get weirdly distant in bed. At least, that's how it felt to me. The passion wasn't there anymore, and I'd chalk it up to stress or whatever excuse she'd feed me. I'm just tired, she'd say, or it's been a long week. But those excuses were always there. No matter how much I tried to connect, she was always pulling away. At first, I thought maybe it was me. Maybe I wasn't doing enough to keep things exciting, or maybe I was just failing her in ways I couldn't see. But something in the back of my mind knew it was more than that. It wasn't just about me. It wasn't about being a better husband or anything like that. It was about her. And I couldn't put my finger on why it was all changing, why I felt like she wasn't the same anymore. She started spending more time with her friends. And I mean more time. Like every weekend she had a girls' night out, or a brunch, or some random event she'd sign up for. When I asked about it, she'd get defensive. "You're being paranoid," she'd say, and it was always wrapped in a tone that made me feel like I was overreacting. But I wasn't stupid. I knew something was off. One night, after she came home late from one of her nights out, I asked her about it again. I'd been feeling this gut-punching sense that I was losing her, and that night, it all spilled over. "You've been acting weird lately," I told her, trying to keep my voice steady. "You're always gone, and when you're here, you're distant." She rolled her eyes, like I was making a mountain out of a molehill. "I'm just busy, Greg. You wouldn't understand." Her voice had this sharp edge to it, and I could feel it cutting through the space between us. That's when it hit me, the defensiveness, the irritation. It wasn't about me. It was about her. I pushed a little harder. "Are you seeing someone else?" Her eyes widened, and she immediately shifted her stance, like she was caught off guard by the question. But then she just laughed it off. "What? No. That's ridiculous. You're being paranoid." She tried to walk away, but I grabbed her arm before she could get too far. "Don't walk away from me, Sarah. I need to know if this is what's really going on. If there's someone else." My voice trailed off, the words heavy in the air between us. She yanked her arm from my grip, a quick jerk of annoyance. "You want the truth," she spat. "Fine. Yes. I've been seeing someone else. Dean. He's better than you, okay?" Her words hit like a slap, and I swear I didn't even feel my legs give way until I was standing there, dumbfounded. I don't remember much after that, just the sound of my heart hammering in my chest, like it was trying to escape. She stood there, arms crossed, eyes darting between me and the ground, not even bothering to apologize, just waiting for me to say something. Anything. But what was there to say? What could I even say to that? She didn't seem to care that she just laid the bombshell of my life at my feet. She was just standing there, waiting for my reaction, and I couldn't do anything but stare at her. The confession hit me like a freight train, but at the same time, it was like the air had been sucked out of the room. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the words circling in my head. She had been seeing someone else. Not just anyone, but some guy named Dean. And what she said next echoed louder than anything. He was better than me. He gave her what I couldn't. It felt like someone had shoved a knife into my chest and twisted it. All those little things I'd sensed, the distance, the coldness, the way she'd shut me out, those were all pieces of a puzzle I hadn't been able to see until she just laid it out for me. I wasn't enough. I was just not enough. There were 1,000 questions running through my head, but none of them seemed important anymore. The realization that the woman I'd given everything to had found someone else, someone who could do what I couldn't, made me feel like a shadow of myself. It wasn't just about being bad in bed, though. It was the betrayal, the feeling of being made small, of having my worth judged by something as shallow as that. I watched her in the moments after she told me, trying to read her expression, trying to find some hint of remorse or regret. But there was nothing. Just a coldness that made me feel even smaller. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She wasn't even looking at me the same way. Her eyes were empty, like I didn't matter anymore. And maybe I didn't. Maybe I never had. It wasn't like I was blind to the changes in our relationship over the last few months. I had noticed the late nights, the sudden obsession with looking good for these girls' nights she was always going on about, the way she would always be on her phone, laughing at some private joke that I wasn't part of. But I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that it would pass. But it didn't. It only got worse. I spent the rest of the night in a fog. The pain was so raw, so fresh, that I couldn't even think straight. I didn't know what to do, what to say, or if I even wanted to say anything. The only thing I could focus on was the crushing weight of her words. He's better than you. They echoed in my mind every time I tried to sleep, every time I looked at her. I couldn't shake it. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I even wanted to. The next day, everything felt different. The air between us was thick, tense, suffocating. She avoided eye contact, acting like nothing had changed, like we were still some happy couple who could just pretend everything was fine. I wanted to scream at her, to ask how she could stand there and act so unaffected by what she'd done. But I didn't. I just sat there, quiet, too numb to respond in any way that would make sense. I don't know how long we sat in silence, but eventually, she broke it, like she always did. She tried to apologize, but it was half-hearted. It wasn't the apology of someone who was truly sorry for what they'd done. It was the apology of someone who was more concerned about keeping the peace than owning up to the damage they'd caused. She kept saying things like, "I didn't want to hurt you, and it wasn't about you." I hated that. Because it was about me. Everything about this was about me. It was about the trust she shattered, the promises she broke, the connection we'd built that she just tossed aside like it was nothing. But I didn't react. I didn't shout. I didn't throw things. I didn't storm out. I just nodded, like I was listening, but really, I was thinking of the worst possible ways to make her understand what she'd done. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't looking for some dramatic revenge scene. I just wanted her to feel what I felt, to understand the kind of emptiness she'd left behind. And for a while, I thought about it, about what would hurt her the most. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. So I stayed calm. I stayed quiet. And I let her believe that maybe, just maybe, I was too weak to do anything about it. What she didn't know was that I was already planning something, but it wasn't going to be some angry outburst. No, my revenge was going to be different. I was going to hit her where it would hurt the most. The one thing she cared about more than anything. Her image. Her reputation. But before that, I had to make sure I was strong enough to do it. So, I started to take care of myself. It's funny how things change once you realize you've been betrayed. The whole dynamic shifts, and I wasn't the man I used to be. Not right away, of course. In the days after she told me, I was still raw, still reeling from the pain. But as time passed, I started noticing things about myself, things I hadn't cared much about before. I wasn't the best version of myself when Sarah first dropped the bomb on me. I'd let myself go, letting stress and the routine of life turn me into someone who wasn't really living. I wasn't out of shape or anything, but I hadn't been paying attention to how I looked, or how I felt inside. I had gotten comfortable, too comfortable. It's like when things are good, you stop putting in the effort. But the moment she told me about Dean, it was like a switch flipped in my head. If she could throw me aside so easily, if she could find someone else who made her feel better, then I'd be damned if I didn't take that as a wake-up call. The first thing I did was start working out. It wasn't anything drastic at first, just a little more cardio, a few weights here and there. But it felt good, really good. It felt like I was getting some control back. It was like I was taking back what she had stolen from me, bit by bit. The more I worked out, the stronger I felt, both physically and mentally. I started paying attention to what I ate, what I wore. I made sure I looked good when I went out, when I was at work. Not for her, but for me. It was for me. I also picked up a few new hobbies. Something to keep my mind off everything. I started reading more, got into photography, even started learning how to cook a little. It felt like I was discovering parts of myself I had forgotten about, parts one had neglected while I was busy focusing on trying to make Sarah happy. It wasn't easy, and there were days when I felt like I was just going through the motions, but every small victory felt like a step forward. And Sarah? Well, she noticed. I could see it in her eyes when she'd catch me leaving for the gym or when she'd find me lost in a book. There was this look of confusion on her face, like she didn't quite know how to process it. For the first time in a long time, I wasn't the guy she thought she had all figured out. I wasn't the guy who would sit around and wait for her to change her mind. I was becoming someone else, someone stronger, someone who didn't need her validation to feel good about himself. But the best part? I didn't even have to say a word to her. I didn't have to tell her I was moving on or that I was working on myself. She could see it, and that was enough. It wasn't just about the physical changes either. It was the way I carried myself now. I wasn't as passive. I wasn't as forgiving. Every time she came to me, trying to apologize or act like everything was normal, I just let her. I didn't engage the way I used to. I didn't beg her to stay. I didn't need her anymore. And the more I let her try to pull me back in, the more I pushed her away. I didn't let her know just how much it hurt. I didn't let her see how badly she'd cut me. Instead, I showed her that I was fine, better than fine. And as I worked on myself, something started happening that I didn't expect. She started to change. She started dressing differently, putting more effort into her appearance. She began acting needy, I guess you could say. She'd want to spend more time with me, trying to make up for what she'd done, but I could see right through it. It wasn't genuine. It wasn't because she cared. It was because she was scared of losing me. It was almost pathetic in a way. She wanted to be the center of my world again, but the thing was, I didn't need her to be anymore. I was building something for myself, something I hadn't had before. A life that didn't revolve around her. And that, more than anything, was what stung her the most. I was becoming someone she couldn't control, and it terrified her. But I didn't want to make it easy for her. No, that wouldn't teach her anything. Instead, I kept playing it cool. I didn't yell, didn't demand explanations, didn't beg for answers. I just let her watch me. Watch me become someone better. Someone she couldn't have back. The more I pulled away, the more she started chasing. It was a strange feeling, watching her scramble to get back to the man she thought she knew. But it wasn't the same anymore. She couldn't have me. Not like she used to. It felt like I was winning in a way I hadn't expected. It wasn't about revenge in the way most people think. It wasn't about getting even, or some grand gesture. It was about me standing up for myself. About proving to myself that I didn't need her to be whole. I was enough without her. And that, in the end, was going to be her biggest loss. At some point, I realized that I wasn't just hurting anymore. I was healing. Slowly, but surely, the pieces of me that had been shattered were starting to come back together. And as that happened, I began to see Sarah in a new light. It wasn't just her betrayal I was angry about. It was the way she had treated me all along. The way she had made me feel small, unimportant, like I was nothing more than a stepping stone in her life. I knew that if I was going to do this right, if I was really going to make her understand just what she'd done, it wasn't about confronting her directly or screaming at her. No, it was more subtle than that. She thought she could walk away from me, that she could have her affair and come back to the safety of our life together when it was convenient. But I wasn't going to let her think for 1 second that she could have it both ways. I started with the people around her. Our friends. The ones she was always so careful to impress. She was obsessed with her social status, always worried about what others thought of her. So, I began to plant little seeds of doubt. Nothing overt, just small comments here and there, casual mentions in passing that made people question her character. I wasn't spreading full-blown rumors, not at first. I didn't need to. All it took was dropping a subtle hint. A quiet whisper about her spending more time with Dean than she let on. A comment about how maybe things aren't always what they seem with her and Greg. It was all small stuff, but enough to get the ball rolling. I let people wonder, let them question her loyalty. And the more I pulled back from Sarah, the more they started to notice things about her too. It wasn't just her friends either. The whispers spread to other circles, acquaintances, and even some of the people she worked with. She never knew where it was coming from. One day, a mutual friend would mention something about how Sarah seems different lately, don't you think? Or how it's crazy what's happening with her and Greg. The idea that I could manipulate her social image, just by quietly feeding the right people with little jabs, gave me a strange sense of power. It wasn't loud or confrontational. It was so much more effective than that. And Sarah? She had no idea what was happening. She kept trying to act like things were fine between us, like we were just going through a rough patch. She'd try to pull me in, make small talk, ask how my day was, but I'd give her just enough attention to make her think I was still interested, without actually showing any real care. I wasn't cold, I wasn't dismissive, but I wasn't warm either. I kept just enough distance to make her feel like she had to work for it. And the more I did that, the more she seemed to need me. It was like she couldn't stand the idea of me not needing her anymore. It wasn't just the social stuff, either. I started to notice the little ways she'd try to win me back, asking me to join her for dinner, suggesting we watch a movie together, pretending everything was just as it was before the affair. But every time she'd get close, I'd pull away just enough. I'd tell her I was busy, or that I was doing something else. The more I did that, the more she'd keep trying. It was like she couldn't understand that I didn't need her approval anymore. The guilt she seemed to feel was starting to show, but it wasn't real guilt, it was more like fear. Fear that I wasn't going to be there for her anymore. And as much as I hated what she'd done to me, I couldn't deny that part of me enjoyed seeing her squirm a little. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't devastated. I was moving on. And that was the part that really got to her. She wanted me back, and she couldn't figure out how to do it. Every time she thought she was close, I pulled away. Every time she thought she could turn the tide, I pushed her further out. I wasn't letting her have that power over me anymore. I wasn't going to be the guy who sat around and begged for her to come back. She wanted me back? Fine. But she was going to have to chase me. And even then, it was too late. I didn't need her anymore. And deep down, I think she knew that. As the weeks passed, something started to shift in Sarah. She wasn't as confident anymore, not in the way she used to be. She'd always been the one who held all the cards. At least, that's how she acted. She'd always known I'd come back to her, always knew I'd forgive her, always thought she could play me and still have me around when it suited her. But that power she once had over me, the one she could wield so easily, was slipping away. I could see it in the way she looked at me when I'd come home late from the gym or when I'd take longer at work. She'd try to pretend like it didn't bother her, but it did. She could feel the distance between us now, and it was eating at her. It was a subtle thing at first. A pause in conversation. A lingering glance when she thought I wasn't looking. But then, it started getting more obvious. She began dressing up more, even when she wasn't going anywhere. She'd ask me if I thought she looked good, and I'd just nod, not giving her more than a passing glance. She started trying to rekindle things, asking me about old memories, joking around like nothing had happened. I could see she was testing the waters, trying to gauge how far I'd gone, how much I'd pulled away. But the more she tried to pull me in, the more I pushed her away. I didn't need her to fill some void inside me anymore. I didn't need her for validation or to feel like I had a place in the world. I had that all on my own now. And it wasn't even that I didn't care about her anymore, because a part of me still did, but it was different. I didn't respect her the way I once did. She had taken my trust, my heart, and my self-worth and just stomped all over it. And that was the part that really stung her. It wasn't the affair itself. It wasn't Dean. It was that I didn't need her anymore. She couldn't fix it. She couldn't make it right. She couldn't just smile her way back into my life like she had before. That control, the control she had over me, was gone. And now, she was starting to feel it, starting to realize the gravity of what she had done. She tried to play the "we're fine" game, acting like nothing had changed, trying to put on this brave face, but I could see through it. She wasn't fooling me anymore. She was scared. Scared of losing me for good. And she didn't know what to do about it. It was about this time when I started noticing her getting more anxious. She'd check her phone more often, and I'd catch her staring at it, like she was waiting for some message or some sign that everything was still okay. She wasn't getting the reactions she used to from her friends, either. I could tell, even from the way she carried herself, that the rumors I'd been sowing had started to spread, and they were taking root. People were starting to talk. She wasn't the golden girl anymore, the one who could do no wrong. The whispers were there, just beneath the surface. People had started to question her, and I hadn't even had to do much. I hadn't needed to say a word to anyone, just a few subtle hints here and there, and the rest took care of itself. I'd planted the seed, and now it was growing all on its own. And as that seed spread, Sarah's walls began to crack. The guilt was there, but not in the way I wanted it to be. It wasn't true remorse. It wasn't a realization of how badly she'd hurt me. It was more like a fear of being judged, of losing the high status she had always worked so hard to maintain. It was a desperate attempt to claw back some semblance of the life she had before she messed everything up. I could feel her eyes on me, watching for signs of weakness, trying to gauge if I'd finally let go of the hurt. But I didn't. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger was easy. No, I was done being angry. I was too busy rebuilding my life without her. And that, in itself, was driving her mad. She started to come at me with apologies, not the half-hearted ones she used to give, but full-on attempts to get me back. But I didn't need her apologies anymore. I wasn't seeking closure from her. I wasn't looking for some grand moment of reconciliation. I'd already moved on from that. She didn't realize it, but the moment she walked away from me to be with Dean, I started walking away from her, too. And by the time she realized that I wasn't just physically distant, but emotionally, too, that I wasn't going to be her fallback, her safe place anymore, it was already too late. She'd already lost me. But what hurt her the most was that I wasn't waiting around for her to come back. I didn't care anymore. I was moving on, becoming the person I'd always been meant to be, with or without her. And as much as she tried to make things right, she couldn't erase what she'd done. She could never go back to the man she once knew. And that's when the regret hit her the hardest. As time passed, something shifted in Sarah that I couldn't ignore. I'd always known her to be strong-willed, confident, the one who had the control in our relationship. But now, that control was slipping through her fingers like sand. The more I moved forward without her, the more she began to crumble. It was subtle at first. She'd ask me to do little things for her, things I used to do without hesitation. Helping her with errands, fixing something around the house, or even just picking up dinner. And I did them, but not out of love or obligation. I did them with this air of indifference, like I was doing her a favor, but it wasn't because I was still invested in her. It was because I knew it made her feel like I was still the person who cared. But she wasn't getting the reaction she wanted. She was expecting me to be the Greg she could manipulate again, the one who would drop everything to make her happy. Instead, she got a version of me that didn't need her anymore. That was when I saw the change in her. She started chasing. It wasn't obvious at first, not in the way you might expect. She didn't come running after me, begging for forgiveness, but there was a different energy about her. She started dressing nicer, always trying to look perfect, always making sure her hair was just right when she knew I'd be around. She'd go out of her way to ask how my day was, even pretending to take an interest in things she'd never cared about before. Little things, but I could tell she was trying to get back to the version of me who would be drawn in by her charm. The thing is, I wasn't that guy anymore. She was trying to get me back by doing all the things she thought I wanted. She'd cook me dinner, make my favorite drinks, ask if I wanted to watch a movie, all in the hopes that I'd fall back into the old rhythm, the one where she could easily slip back into my arms. But it didn't work. It couldn't. Not after everything that had happened. Not after what I had learned about myself, about what I was worth outside of her approval. Every time she'd get close, I'd pull away, just enough to make her feel the distance. It wasn't malicious. It wasn't that I wanted to hurt her. It was just that I didn't need to be that guy anymore, the one who was always chasing her, always putting her needs before mine. I wasn't desperate for her love or attention anymore. And I could see it in her eyes, the confusion, the panic as she realized that she didn't have the same hold over me anymore. That was when she started to really regret. I could see it in the way she'd start picking fights, trying to stir up old emotions, trying to get me to react in a way that would give her something to work with. But I wasn't biting. I wasn't engaging. I was calm, collected, and unbothered. Every time she tried to pull me back into the same old dynamic, I just remained steady. I wasn't trying to get back at her. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was simply moving forward without her, and that, more than anything, was what drove her crazy. She tried everything, talking about the future, asking about things we could do together, acting like the past didn't exist, like the affair hadn't happened. But I wasn't falling for it. I wasn't playing along with her game anymore. She started to feel it in her social life too. She could tell that people were starting to look at her differently. Friends who once adored her were pulling away. I wasn't the only one noticing her behavior, and the whispers I had quietly fed into her circles were starting to catch up with her. People weren't as quick to overlook things anymore. The people who used to adore her now seemed to be questioning her, and that hurt her more than anything. I'd see her start to put on this facade, trying to be the life of the party again, trying to show everyone that she was fine, that she had everything under control. But it was obvious. She was scrambling. She was chasing something she couldn't catch. She was chasing me, but I wasn't there anymore. What she didn't realize was that the more she chased me, the further away I became. And the more I pulled away, the more she realized how much she had to lose. Not just me. She realized that she was losing the person she had once held in the palm of her hand, the person who would have forgiven her, would have tried to make it work. But I wasn't that person anymore. The man she had betrayed, the man she thought she could walk away from without consequences, was long gone. That was the part that hurt her the most. Not that I was angry, not that I was upset, but that I had simply moved on. I had stopped needing her. And now, no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she chased after me, she couldn't get me back. Because I wasn't running. I was just already gone. And that was something she couldn't fix. By now, Sarah's attempts to win me back had become more desperate. She wasn't just trying to pull me closer anymore. She was pleading, without saying a word, for me to notice her again. It wasn't just the things she was doing, like dressing up, calling me more often, or asking for help with things I used to do out of habit. It was the way she looked at me when she thought I wasn't paying attention, that small flicker of vulnerability in her eyes that said she knew she was losing me for good. I could see it. I could feel it. She was unraveling, and she didn't know how to stop it. The woman who once had everything together, the one who was always the center of every room she entered, was falling apart in small, subtle ways. It wasn't just me she was losing, it was her grip on the life she had so carefully built. The life where she was in control. The life where she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. I started to notice her at social events, looking out of place, like she wasn't sure where she belonged anymore. She was constantly checking her phone, always looking around for someone, for something to fill the void she felt. I wasn't part of her world anymore. And for a woman like Sarah, that was devastating. Her whole identity had been tied to her image, her popularity, and now that was crumbling. She'd tried to engage with friends, but they were starting to avoid her. There were whispers, and she knew it. She'd ask me if we could talk, but I wouldn't engage. I didn't need to. She had done enough talking already, and none of it was going to fix anything. But she couldn't let it go. Every time I acted indifferent, every time I pulled away, it chipped away at her confidence. She thought she could control everything, but she was losing control. And the worst part was, she was starting to realize it wasn't just me she'd lost. It was her own image, her place in her own world. She came home one evening, her eyes puffy from crying, her makeup a little smeared. She tried to hide it, but I could tell. I could feel the change in the air as soon as she walked in. The energy was different. She was fragile, and that scared her. She didn't know how to handle this version of herself. The version of herself that wasn't the confident, charming Sarah who could get anything she wanted. No, this was someone who had fucked up. Someone who had lost everything. And that scared her more than anything. She sat down next to me, as if trying to get my attention. But I didn't look at her. I kept reading the paper, acting like she wasn't even there. She said something about how things used to be so easy for us, how we used to laugh, talk, just be. I could feel her trying to reconnect, trying to get me to open up, but I couldn't. Not anymore. She tried again. I miss how we were, Greg. Don't you miss it? Don't you miss us? I didn't respond at first. I let the silence fill the room. I could feel her waiting, hoping for me to react the way I used to, hoping for me to beg her to stay, to tell her it was all going to be okay. But I didn't. I wasn't that person anymore. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of thinking she could just fix things with a few words. When I finally did look at her, there was no anger, no hatred. There was just nothing. I don't miss what we were, Sarah. Because what we were wasn't real. You broke that. You broke me. And now, I don't need to go back to it. I've moved on. Her face crumpled at those words, and for the first time, I saw something in her I hadn't seen before. Regret. Real, raw regret. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, frozen, like she couldn't believe what she was hearing. Like she hadn't realized just how far we had fallen until that moment. But I wasn't doing this for her. I wasn't trying to make her feel guilty or sorry for what she'd done. I was simply stating the truth. I had moved on. And the moment she realized that, she started to lose it. That night, she didn't sleep in our bed. She tossed and turned in the guest room, and I could hear her crying softly through the door. But I didn't go to her. I didn't comfort her. I didn't tell her everything would be okay. I just stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling nothing. The only thing I felt was the overwhelming relief of knowing that I had broken free. For a while, I'd been afraid that I'd never be able to let go of her, that her betrayal would haunt me forever. But now, I realized that it had been the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it pushed me to look at myself in a way I hadn't before. To realize that I was worth more than her lies. More than her game. More than the person she wanted me to be. I wasn't her backup. I wasn't the guy she could walk all over when she needed to. And as I lay there that night, I knew for sure that I would never go back to the man I was before. The man who needed her. The man who thought his world revolved around her. That guy was gone. And now, I was the one who held the power. As the days went by, Sarah tried to keep up the act, but I could see the cracks forming more and more. She couldn't keep pretending. Every attempt she made to reconnect felt hollow, forced, like she was trying to play a role she wasn't sure how to perform anymore. She had no idea what to do with the new version of me. The man who wasn't broken, the man who didn't need her validation to feel whole. And every time she tried to make things normal, it only reminded me how far we'd drifted apart. It wasn't just her that had changed, though. I had too. I wasn't the guy who would just forgive and forget anymore. I wasn't going to sweep her betrayal under the rug like I might have in the past. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. That part of me had died the moment she confessed, and the more time passed, the more I realized how much better off I was without her trying to control my every move. She might have thought she was the one calling the shots, but I'd already left that behind. But I wasn't going to make it easy for her to just slip back into my life. That would have been too simple. She didn't deserve that, not after everything she'd put me through. I knew she was starting to panic. Her world, the one she'd built around her image, was falling apart. The rumors about her were starting to spread further than I had ever expected. People had started to look at her differently. Not with judgment, necessarily, but with caution. They were starting to question her. And the worst part was, she knew that. She still tried to salvage whatever she could with me. She'd leave notes around the house, little reminders of the good times we shared. I'd find them tucked into my shoes, under the pillow, or stuck to the bathroom mirror. She wanted me to remember how we were before, like all of this, the affair, the lies, the betrayal, could just be erased. But it wasn't that simple. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about the fact that she had changed, too. And not for the better. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I wasn't looking for some dramatic confrontation or an apology that I knew would never come. What I was doing, what I had been doing all along, was showing her that I didn't need her. Not in the way she thought I did. Not the way I once had, when I thought she was the center of my world. She had convinced me I needed her to feel good about myself, but I'd learned the hard way that I didn't. The tipping point came one evening when she came home late, clearly frazzled, like the weight of everything was finally sinking in. I could see it in her eyes, the panic. She was grasping for control, and the desperation was obvious. She tried to apologize again, but this time, there was something different about it. Something more genuine. She admitted that she regretted the affair, that she was sorry for everything, that she knew she had messed up. But it wasn't enough. I didn't say anything for a long time. I just stood there, watching her, and I could see the tears starting to form, the shaky breath she took when she realized how little she was getting from me. She tried to reach out, to touch me, but I stepped back. "I'm not that person anymore, Sarah," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I don't need your apologies. I don't need you to tell me you're sorry. It doesn't change anything." She looked crushed. There was a visible ache in her face, like she had finally realized the truth, that I wasn't coming back. Not this time. And that was the point, wasn't it? She had already taken everything from me. My trust, my dignity, my self-respect. I wasn't going to give her the satisfaction of seeing me fall apart. But more than that, I wasn't going to let her think she could just waltz back into my life with some heartfelt apology and a promise to do better. I had learned the hard way that her words meant nothing. It was her actions that spoke the loudest. I turned away from her and walked out of the room. I didn't even look back. That was the final blow. Not the affair itself. Not her regret or her apology. But the realization that I had already moved on. Mentally, emotionally, and physically. I had become someone else. Someone who didn't need her, who didn't rely on her to feel like I had worth. As I left her standing there, I realized that this was the most painful thing I could have done to her. I didn't have to scream, didn't have to confront her, didn't have to do anything dramatic. I just had to walk away, and leave her with the knowledge that, no matter what, I was never coming back. She couldn't fix it. She couldn't win me back. She had lost me. For good. And that was something she would have to live with for the rest of her life. It wasn't easy, at first. Walking away from someone you spent years with, someone you thought you'd grow old with, it never is. But what I learned over time was that the hardest part wasn't leaving her. It was realizing that I had stayed in a relationship that wasn't working for way too long. I had ignored the signs, brushed things off, convinced myself that things would get better. But the truth was, I had been lying to myself. When I finally walked away, it felt like the weight of the world had lifted off my shoulders. It wasn't that I didn't still have feelings for her. Of course I did. She had been my wife. We had built something together. But the reality was, she had destroyed it. She had shattered everything we had, piece by piece, and the person who walked away from her that night wasn't the same person who had walked into that marriage years ago. I started doing things for me. I hadn't realized how much of myself I had given up to keep her happy, to keep her pleased, to keep her with me. It had been years since I'd done something just because I wanted to. No one had told me to work out, but I did it because it made me feel strong. No one told me to pick up that guitar again, but I did. I'd forgotten how much I used to love playing. Little by little, I was putting pieces of myself back together. I joined a few classes, took a trip with some old friends, started meeting new people. People who saw me for who I was, not for the guy I had been while I was with Sarah. I could feel the difference in how they looked at me. They didn't see me as someone broken, someone who had been cheated on. They saw me as someone who had survived, who had moved on, who had learned to live life again. And for the first time in years, I felt alive. Sarah, on the other hand, wasn't doing so well. I could tell. I heard things, through the grapevine, from mutual friends. She was struggling to maintain the image of herself that she'd worked so hard to create. People weren't as quick to forgive her as she had hoped. Her social life, which had once been a source of constant validation, was slowly falling apart. The rumors hadn't stopped. She was still seen as the one who had betrayed her husband, and no matter how much she tried to fix things, the stain on her reputation wasn't going away. I wasn't proud of how I'd manipulated the situation to create doubt in her social circle, but I couldn't deny that it had worked. The whispers were still there. People were still asking questions about her. And I didn't care. Because by that point, I wasn't thinking about revenge anymore. I wasn't trying to hurt her or punish her. I had already moved on. But what I couldn't ignore was how she had underestimated me. She thought I was weak, thought I'd never leave her. She thought she could betray me and still have me on standby. And now, she was the one chasing me. She tried to reach out a few times. Sometimes it was a text, sometimes a call. A lot of times, it was an apology wrapped in a vague message. But each time, I ignored it. I wasn't going to drag this out with her. There was nothing left to say. I had already said everything I needed to when I told her I didn't need her anymore. But here's the thing. It wasn't about being cold or cruel. It was about me taking control of my own life again. It was about me finding out who I was without her, without the weight of her lies, without being her safety net. And slowly, piece by piece, I was becoming a better version of myself. A version of me that I liked. A version of me that I could stand to be around. And I'm not going to lie, it felt good. It felt so damn good to finally be free. Not just from her, but from the idea that I needed her to make me feel whole. I didn't need her. I never did. I wasn't a failure. I wasn't some guy who had been broken by a betrayal. I wasn't the guy who was defined by a wife who cheated on him. I was stronger now. I was the guy who had learned to walk away. I could see her spiraling. But I wasn't going to save her. That wasn't my job anymore. She had made her choices, and she had to live with them. As for me, I was finally living for me. And it felt like the first time in a long time that I was truly alive, without her. And that's the part I'll never forget. Not the hurt, not the pain, but the fact that I didn't let it destroy me. I rose above it. And in the end, that's all that matters.